Imagine a quiet street, the kind that most people pass by every day without a second thought. But today, something is about to unfold that will leave you questioning everything. The sounds of traffic hum in the background, and the ordinary rhythm of daily life continues, but there's a storm brewing just around the corner. In one fleeting moment, an unexpected encounter will ignite a fierce confrontation. It begins with a homeless black man, sitting quietly on the sidewalk, trying to escape the bitter cold. His life, like so many others living on the streets, is a daily battle for survival, filled with struggles that most people never see. But today, his struggle is about to take on a new form. Across the street, a woman steps out of her house, her expression tense, her eyes scanning the street with a kind of impatience. She's had enough of the man's presence, enough of the people like him who seem to be taking over the neighborhood. She's heard the whispers, seen the glances, and now, something inside of her snaps. Without warning, she grabs a garden hose from the side of her house, the heavy nozzle in her hand like a weapon, ready to attack. Her intentions are clear, but what happens next? Well, that's where this story takes a shocking turn. The woman approaches the man, her steps swift and deliberate. The air feels thick with tension as she raises the hose, aiming it squarely at the man who looks up, startled. For a brief moment, their eyes lock, his filled with confusion, hers with disdain. She doesn't hesitate. The powerful stream of water shoots out, hitting him square in the chest. The cold water drenches him in an instant, splashing over his face, his clothes, and the pavement around him. He stumbles back, coughing, wiping his face in a mix of shock and anger. This isn't just about the water, though. It's a symbolic act, a reflection of a deeper, more poisonous hatred that fuels her actions. But here's where it gets interesting. What happens after the attack? The man, soaked and humiliated, doesn't retreat. Instead, he stands there, his eyes burning with something more than just anger. There's something in his gaze that makes you wonder, what's next? The woman, seemingly expecting him to run away in fear, is caught off guard. What she didn't anticipate was the strength of his spirit, the defiance in his posture. She thought he would crumble under the weight of her attack, but instead, she's met with a sense of resistance that shakes her to the core. As the situation continues to unfold, other people begin to notice the scene. A few passers-by stop to watch, their phones coming out as the tension grows. Some of them whisper, others speak up, unsure of how to intervene or if they should at all. The woman, now realizing the attention she's drawn, starts to feel the weight of her actions. But it's too late to take it back. The man, still standing, doesn't just look at her anymore. He looks beyond her, looking for a sense of justice that he knows might never come. But what happens next? How does the woman respond to the unexpected defiance of the man she thought would simply accept her cruelty? What does the crowd do? And most importantly, what happens when this moment is captured on video, spreading across the internet, sparking outrage and igniting a debate about race, class, and justice? You won't believe the twist that's about to unfold. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Imagine a quiet street, the kind that most people pass by every day without a second thought. But today, something is about to unfold that will leave you questioning everything. The sounds of traffic hum in the background, and the ordinary rhythm of daily life continues, but there's a storm brewing just around the corner. In one fleeting moment, an unexpected encounter will ignite a fierce confrontation. It begins with a homeless black man, sitting quietly on the sidewalk, trying to escape the bitter cold. His life, like so many others living on the streets, is a daily battle for survival, filled with struggles that most people never see. But today, his struggle is about to take on a new form. Across the street, a woman steps out of her house, her expression tense, her eyes scanning the street with a kind of impatience. She's had enough of the man's presence, enough of the people like him who seem to be taking over the neighborhood. She's heard the whispers, seen the glances, and now, something inside of her snaps. Without warning, she grabs a garden hose from the side of her house, the heavy nozzle in her hand like a weapon, ready to attack. Her intentions are clear, but what happens next? Well, that's where this story takes a shocking turn. The woman approaches the man, her steps swift and deliberate. The air feels thick with tension as she raises the hose, aiming it squarely at the man who looks up, startled. For a brief moment, their eyes lock, his filled with confusion, hers with disdain. She doesn't hesitate. The powerful stream of water shoots out, hitting him square in the chest. The cold water drenches him in an instant, splashing over his face, his clothes, and the pavement around him. He stumbles back, coughing, wiping his face in a mix of shock and anger. This isn't just about the water, though. It's a symbolic act, a reflection of a deeper, more poisonous hatred that fuels her actions. But here's where it gets interesting. What happens after the attack? The man, soaked and humiliated, doesn't retreat. Instead, he stands there, his eyes burning with something more than just anger. There's something in his gaze that makes you wonder, what's next? The woman, seemingly expecting him to run away in fear, is caught off guard. What she didn't anticipate was the strength of his spirit, the defiance in his posture. She thought he would crumble under the weight of her attack, but instead, she's met with a sense of resistance that shakes her to the core. As the situation continues to unfold, other people begin to notice the scene. A few passers-by stop to watch, their phones coming out as the tension grows. Some of them whisper, others speak up, unsure of how to intervene or if they should at all. The woman, now realizing the attention she's drawn, starts to feel the weight of her actions. But it's too late to take it back. The man, still standing, doesn't just look at her anymore. He looks beyond her, looking for a sense of justice that he knows might never come. But what happens next? How does the woman respond to the unexpected defiance of the man she thought would simply accept her cruelty? What does the crowd do? And most importantly, what happens when this moment is captured on video, spreading across the internet, sparking outrage and igniting a debate about race, class, and justice? You won't believe the twist that's about to unfold. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over, and what happens next will leave you speechless. The man stood there, drenched, his clothes clinging to his skin as he wiped the water from his eyes. His breath came out in shaky clouds, the cold not just from the water but from the sting of humiliation. He wasn't a stranger to hardship. Life on the streets had forced him to learn how to survive, how to let go of things he could no longer afford to hold onto, like pride, like dignity, and sometimes even hope. But now, as he stared back at the woman who had attacked him, something shifted. The small, quiet part of him that had learned to accept things for what they were, without questioning, started to stir. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. He had lived on these streets long enough to see how people like him were treated. He had seen the disdain in the eyes of passers-by, heard the whispers behind his back, and felt the judgment every time someone looked the other way. Being homeless meant you became invisible to some and a target to others. There were days when he could barely remember his own name, let alone the dreams he once had before life had swept them away. But today was different. The woman's hose wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he had come to endure. Her harsh, swift movement made it clear she hadn't planned on any resistance. She had expected him to cower, to shrink in fear and submission. She had thought she could wash away the sight of him with a simple blast of water. What she hadn't counted on was the fact that his spirit wasn't as fragile as she might have hoped. The woman's face was now a mix of confusion and irritation, her grip tightening on the hose. She had made her point in her mind. So why wasn't he retreating? The man didn't know how much longer he could stand there, drenched and staring at her, but something in him told him to stay. He could feel the stares of the people around him, some curious, some judgmental, others perhaps even sympathetic, but none of them stepping forward to do anything. They all watched as he remained rooted to the spot. But what could they do? What could anyone do when it seemed like they had no stake in the game? What was a man like him, standing on the sidewalk, compared to the woman who had likely never experienced the kind of struggles he had faced? There was a distance between them, one built on years of privilege, on assumptions, and on the unspoken hierarchy that kept society running as it did. As the woman's eyes flicked nervously around at the growing number of onlookers, something inside her shifted. She had wanted control, wanted to assert her dominance, to push the man back into the invisibility he had occupied for so long. But the longer he stood, unwavering, the more she realized that maybe she had miscalculated. Maybe this wasn't just about the man in front of her. Maybe it was about something she had never fully understood. She glanced at the crowd, hoping someone would speak up, someone would make the situation clear for her. But no one did. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Her fingers were stiff around the hose now. She was hesitating. The sudden awareness that she was the one being watched, that her actions were no longer just a private outburst, caused a shift in the atmosphere. Was she being judged? Was this moment going to define her in ways she didn't want? What had she hoped to achieve, really? Was it simply to chase him off, to make him feel as small and worthless as she perceived him to be? Or was there something deeper, something more complicated at play? She didn't have time to figure it out before the moment slipped further out of her control. A couple of bystanders were whispering now, their phones out, capturing the scene. The soft, constant click of cameras echoed in the distance, and the man noticed, his gaze flicking to the growing crowd around them. In their eyes, he saw something new, curiosity. This wasn't just a random attack. This wasn't just about some homeless man being treated like an inconvenience. No, this moment was becoming something else entirely. It was as though the power had shifted, but where would it go? The woman's face hardened, and the water from the hose continued to spray, but now it seemed more desperate. There was no satisfaction in her movements anymore, just frustration. She was no longer the confident, assertive figure she had been moments ago. She was realizing the consequences of her actions. The fact that the world she lived in was no longer as simple as it seemed. The idea that she could just push someone away, erase them from existence with a stream of water, was crumbling under the weight of what was happening. She had underestimated this man, and now she was left wondering if there was any way to get back the power she once held in this situation. The man didn't speak. He simply stared at her, the silence between them growing louder. The water dripped from his body in heavy drops, soaking into the pavement, washing away the remnants of the attack but not the sting of it. His mind was racing, trying to understand what he was supposed to do in this moment. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some symbol of resistance. He was just a man who had been thrown aside by the world, forced to survive in a society that seemed to care little about people like him. But now, for the first time, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't invisible here. Not anymore. As the seconds ticked by, the woman's movements began to slow, her gaze shifting from him to the people around her. The crowd was growing, more people gathering with their phones out, some recording, others whispering to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief. The situation was beginning to take on a life of its own, and she could sense the shift. It was no longer just a confrontation between two people. It was becoming a spectacle, a moment that people would talk about, would share, and would interpret in their own ways. It was becoming a symbol, something far beyond her initial intention. The man, still soaked but standing firm, suddenly took a step forward. The movement was small, but it was enough to make the woman flinch. She wasn't sure what he would do next. She wasn't sure what she would do next. All she knew was that this moment wasn't going according to her plan, and it was slipping out of her control. The crowd, sensing the shift, became more aware. What was she going to do now? And what was he about to do? What did he want from this moment? The tension in the air was so thick that it felt as if time itself had stopped. The woman's grip tightened on the hose again, but the man's eyes locked with hers, a silent challenge hanging in the space between them. The situation was far from over. And what happened next? Well, that was still a mystery. The crowd held its breath. The man's step forward was a small act, but it felt like a declaration. The woman hesitated, the hose still in her hands, the water nozzle now pointed slightly downward, its power gone from full force to a trickle. For a brief moment, it was as though the whole world had paused. The crowd of onlookers seemed to hold their breath, uncertain of what would come next, unsure whether they should step in, speak up, or simply watch. The woman could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment heavy on her chest. What had started as a simple act of aggression now felt like something far larger, something with consequences she hadn't even considered. But the man wasn't backing down. He looked at her, his wet clothes clinging to him, but there was a certain strength in his stance, an unspoken resilience that made him appear taller than he actually was. The water on his face had washed away any sign of fear or defeat, and now, it was clear that his silence wasn't one of submission. It was defiance. He wasn't going to retreat, not this time, not in front of all these people. The woman's eyes darted around, her mind racing. She had expected him to run off, to turn the other cheek as he had so many times before. But something in him was different today. What did he want from her? What did he want from the world? She had spent her whole life believing that people like him were just part of the background, those who faded into the shadows when the lights were on, those who didn't matter enough to be noticed. But now, standing in front of her, drenched and unbroken, he made her question everything she had ever believed. The crowd began to shift, a few murmurs breaking the silence. Some of them stepped closer, still unsure whether to get involved, while others raised their phones, capturing the moment for social media. It was clear now, this wasn't just a random encounter. This was something that would be remembered. It was the kind of moment that people would share, comment on, and debate for days. And as much as she hated to admit it, the woman knew that her life, her reputation, was now tied to this moment in a way she couldn't easily undo. A voice from the crowd suddenly cut through the tension, a young man with a distinct accent. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his words sharp but not hostile, just full of disbelief. "You think this is okay?" The woman flinched at the question, her grip on the hose tightening once more. She wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected anyone to call her out. She hadn't expected anyone to step forward and challenge her, not in this way. She had believed she was in control of the situation, that she could dictate what happened here. But now, with the eyes of strangers on her and their judgment hanging in the air, she felt a sudden surge of vulnerability. The man looked toward the voice, then back at the woman. The young man's words seemed to land somewhere deep inside him, awakening something. The attacks he had endured over the years, the dismissals, the cruel words, they had all been part of a larger narrative that had been written for him before he even had a chance to speak for himself. But today, he was writing his own story. He wasn't going to let this woman's actions define him, not this time. He didn't say anything. Instead, he took another step closer, his wet feet slapping against the pavement. The crowd murmured nervously, not sure whether to move closer or step back. It felt like something big was about to happen, something that none of them could predict. The woman's eyes narrowed as she noticed his movement. "Don't come any closer," she warned, her voice shaky but still holding onto a semblance of authority. Her grip on the hose tightened again, her eyes flicking between the man and the people around her. The power dynamics had shifted in a way she didn't know how to handle. But the man didn't stop. He was right there now, inches away from her. And for the first time in a long time, he spoke, his voice rough but strong. "You don't get to do this anymore." His words weren't directed at her as much as they were directed at the world she represented, the world that had looked down on him, ignored him, and pushed him aside. "You think you can erase me with a hose, with your hate?" His voice grew louder, echoing off the buildings around them. "You don't get to make me disappear." The woman's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for something to say, something that could regain the power she had once felt. But the more the man spoke, the more she realized that there was nothing she could say. No words could undo what she had done. No explanation would make it right. The crowd was watching, their eyes wide, as if waiting for her to do something, to react. But she had no idea what to do. She had no plan, no script to follow. From the corner of her eye, she saw a few people beginning to move closer, unsure whether to intervene. Some were filming, others just trying to make sense of what was happening. But no one, it seemed, was ready to step in. There was a strange sort of paralysis that had settled over everyone, as though they were all waiting for the situation to resolve itself in some way, hoping that someone else would make the first move. But there was no resolution yet. The man wasn't backing down, and neither was the woman. The tension between them only grew, as did the crowd's unease. The power in the situation was shifting, but to where? And who would ultimately hold it? The man, drenched and defiant, or the woman, trying desperately to retain some semblance of control? As the silence stretched on, one more figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was an older woman, her face marked with years of experience, of wisdom, and perhaps of a pain she hadn't shown to anyone for a long time. She placed a hand on the arm of a man standing next to her and whispered something in his ear. The man nodded, his expression hardening, but there was a quiet resolve behind his eyes. The older woman moved toward the front of the crowd, stepping between the man and the woman with the hose. "Enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. The crowd quieted, sensing the shift. The tension seemed to ripple through the air as the woman with the hose looked at the older woman with a mix of irritation and confusion. "I said enough," the older woman repeated, her gaze steady. She didn't raise her voice, but there was no mistaking the authority in her words. "This has gone far enough." For a moment, the woman holding the hose faltered, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She looked from the older woman to the man, her face still flushed with anger, but something had changed. The game had shifted once again. What happened next, no one could predict. The older woman's calm, steady presence seemed to hang in the air like a quiet storm, and for a brief moment, everyone was still. The woman holding the hose hesitated, her breath shallow, as if caught between the weight of her anger and the unexpected challenge in front of her. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the tension mounting with every passing second. Some held their breath, waiting for the next move, while others shifted from foot to foot, the uncertainty growing like a thick fog. The older woman didn't look away from the woman with the hose. Her expression was firm, but there was no malice in it. She wasn't here to escalate things, she was simply offering an anchor to the chaos. "Let it go," she said softly, her words cutting through the atmosphere like a knife through tension. "This isn't the way. Look around." She gestured with a hand, sweeping it over the growing crowd that now surrounded them, their phones raised, their eyes filled with judgment. "Is this really what you want? To be remembered for this moment?" The woman with the hose's fingers twitched around the nozzle, the water sputtering in an unsteady rhythm, barely a trickle now. She was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts, her mind a jumble of anger, frustration, and uncertainty. She had never expected to be confronted like this, especially not by someone like the older woman, who seemed to have an unspoken authority that made it impossible for her to just ignore. She had thought she could make a point, show her power, and walk away. But now, in the face of resistance, something inside her cracked. The man stood there, dripping wet, his face unreadable. He had stopped speaking, stopped moving, and was simply watching. There was something quiet but strong about the way he held himself, something that kept her from moving forward, from making the next attack. The crowd's eyes weren't just on her now, they were on both of them. His silence wasn't a sign of defeat, it was a challenge in itself. She couldn't escape the fact that everyone was waiting, watching, measuring her every action. And worse, she was aware now, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, they weren't waiting for her to take control. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. The older woman stepped even closer, her voice soft but carrying the weight of experience. "You've made your point, but there's no need to go any further. The damage is done. Let's stop this before it gets worse." The woman with the hose felt her throat tighten. Her eyes flicked to the drenched man in front of her, and then to the crowd, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and expectation. She felt the world closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter as the minutes stretched on. Her hand trembled, the nozzle of the hose still gripped in her fingers, but now the water trickling out of it seemed almost like a feeble attempt to salvage control. An action that wasn't powerful anymore, just a last, desperate grasp at something she no longer understood. The younger man who had spoken earlier, the one who had challenged her, took a small step forward. "You think this makes you feel better?" he asked, his voice low but cutting through the thickening tension. His words were sharp but measured, as if he had been holding them back for a long time. "You think this changes anything?" He motioned to the man who stood silently, still dripping with water. "You think you can just wash him away, make him disappear?" The woman's eyes darted from him to the man, her hands shaking as she took a step back. The words stung more than she expected. They echoed in her mind, growing louder with every heartbeat. The young man wasn't just confronting her. He was confronting everything she had taken for granted, everything she had built her anger on. She wasn't just attacking a homeless man, a stranger. She was attacking someone who had been dehumanized in ways she couldn't even fully understand. And the truth of that hit her like a wave. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, the crowd, the noise, the water from the hose mixing into a haze of confusion and regret. Her chest tightened as the realization started to sink in. She wasn't just in a confrontation with a man on the street. She was standing in front of a mirror, seeing the reflection of her own biases, her own insecurities, her own anger that had been building for far too long. She had never been forced to confront it like this, had never been given the chance to see herself so clearly, and now, with the world watching, she felt exposed. And then the man spoke. His voice, though quiet, seemed to pierce through the haze. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his eyes still locked on hers. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of experience, years of being treated as less than human, of surviving in a world that didn't care about people like him. "You don't know what it's like to be looked at like you don't exist." The woman felt the air leave her lungs. She had never really thought about it before. To her, he had just been a problem, an inconvenience. She had never paused to see the person behind the image, the humanity in his eyes. She had never wondered, About the struggles he faced, the decisions he was forced to make every day just to stay alive. And now, as his words sank in, she could feel the foundation of everything she had believed shaking beneath her. The crowd was silent now, their phones lowered, the tension palpable as they watched this unexpected shift unfold before them. No one knew how to react. They were caught in the same web of uncertainty, unsure if they should applaud the man's quiet strength or if they should sympathize with the woman who had been pushed into a corner by the consequences of her own actions. The older woman, still standing in between them, didn't speak. She merely looked at the woman with the hose, her gaze steady, as if waiting for her to make the next choice. The man's eyes never left the woman who had tried to attack him, and it was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for one final move to break the tension. The woman with the hose looked down at the ground, her fingers still wrapped around the nozzle, but now her grip was loosening. The water, once a tool of control, now seemed like a symbol of something she couldn't wield anymore. She had come out here expecting to force someone into submission, to make a statement, but now she felt smaller than ever. The people who had gathered, the man who had stood his ground, and the older woman who had intervened had all shifted the balance of power in ways she hadn't anticipated. And as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the question hung in the air. What would she do now? Would she finally let go of the power she had clung to for so long? Or would she escalate this moment into something far worse? The answer seemed to lie in the balance, waiting for the right moment to tip the scale. The air around them was thick with anticipation. The woman's grip on the hose had weakened to the point where she barely held onto it anymore, her knuckles white from the tension, her mind racing. The crowd seemed to sense that something was about to happen, but no one dared to make a sound. The older woman's steady gaze remained on her, and for the first time, the woman with the hose began to feel as though she was being watched, not just by the crowd, but by something deeper, something she couldn't run from, no matter how hard she tried. And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed unbearable, the unexpected happened. From the far side of the street, a car screeched to a halt. Tires burning rubber against the pavement, the vehicle's engine still roaring, it seemed like an intrusion in the otherwise tense silence. It wasn't just any car, it was a black SUV, sleek and imposing, its tinted windows almost like a barrier between the chaos and whatever was coming next. The crowd stirred, some people pulling their phones out again, the focus shifting away from the standoff and toward the new arrival. The woman with the hose flinched, her head snapping toward the car. She could feel her heart racing again, a new anxiety crawling up her spine as the vehicle's door swung open. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out, his appearance starkly out of place on this gritty city street. He was wearing a suit that looked too expensive for the scene, his shoes polished to a shine. His face was sharp, his expression unreadable. He moved with an air of confidence that was almost unnerving, as though he knew exactly what was about to unfold. The older woman who had stepped in between them took a half-step back, her brow furrowing. Something in her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible change. The man in the suit didn't seem to notice. He walked directly toward the woman with the hose, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto her. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, his voice smooth but commanding, his words carrying a weight that made it hard to argue. His gaze flickered briefly to the man, still standing there, drenched, watching everything unfold. The woman holding the hose froze. Her pulse quickened, a new layer of fear settling in her stomach. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her voice shaky but defiant, trying to regain some of the authority she'd lost. But the man's calm demeanor only made her feel more fragile. "Doesn't matter who I am," the man in the suit replied. "What matters is that you've made your point. And it's time to go." The tension that had been building in the air between the woman with the hose and the man intensified. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the tension thickening as people tried to piece together what was happening. Who was this man? Why was he here? And what exactly did he want? The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, she stepped back, as though realizing something more was going on, something that was completely outside of their control. Her voice, once a steady anchor, now held a note of uncertainty. "She doesn't need your interference," she said quietly. "She's already made her choice." But the man in the suit wasn't listening. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black card. He offered it to the woman with the hose without a word. The card was unmarked, its surface smooth and black as night. There was no explanation, no name, no details. Just the card. "Take it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The woman hesitated, confusion flickering in her eyes. Her breath caught in her throat, the enormity of the situation suddenly dawning on her. What did he want from her? What was this card? The world around her seemed to stop moving as her fingers hovered near the card, not sure whether to reach for it or pull back. Then, without warning, a voice broke through the tension, loud and unmistakable. "Don't take it." Everyone turned toward the source of the voice, startled by the sudden interruption. It was the young man who had earlier spoken out against her, the one who had questioned her actions. He had been quiet for a while, but now his voice rang out again, raw and full of emotion. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, his eyes now fixed on the man in the suit. This isn't just some random thing. You don't understand." The man in the suit's eyes flicked toward the young man, but he said nothing. He simply kept his focus on the woman, his hand still extended, the card poised in the air between them. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, watching the exchange. The woman could feel the weight of the moment pulling at her. There was no easy way out. If she took the card, it would change everything. But if she didn't, what would happen then? The man in the suit seemed to hold all the answers, and yet the mystery only deepened with every passing second. The older woman's face shifted, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, as though weighing her next move carefully. "You don't know what you're asking," she said, her voice now tinged with something almost like warning. "The consequences are far bigger than you think." The man in the suit didn't react. He simply waited, still extending the card toward the woman, as if his patience had no limits. The woman's hand hovered just inches from the card, her fingers trembling. She could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her chest, but something else, something darker, lurked beneath the surface of her hesitation. The young man's warning had triggered something inside her, a sense that this was about to spiral into something far more dangerous than she could comprehend. And then, just as the crowd seemed to grow more restless, a loud, unmistakable sound broke through the air, a siren, sharp and shrill, its wail cutting through the tension. It wasn't just any siren, it was the unmistakable sound of approaching law enforcement. The crowd scattered, the atmosphere shifting from a tense standstill to a burst of chaos. People began moving in every direction, some retreating, others running toward the scene, eager to get closer, unsure of what was unfolding. The woman with the hose looked around, panic seizing her chest as the siren grew louder. This wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. This was about to become something much bigger. Something that would affect more than just her and the man in front of her. And as the sirens grew louder, so did the stakes. The clock was ticking, and everything was about to change. The sirens grew louder, their wailing echoing off the nearby buildings, growing closer with every passing second. The crowd scattered in a frenzy, some running toward the street corners, others toward the sidewalks, trying to mock a sense of what was happening. The tension in the air was palpable, an invisible storm ready to break. The woman with the hose stood frozen, her hand still hovering above the card, her breath shallow as panic twisted in her gut. What was she supposed to do? The man in the suit remained calm, his posture unchanged, as though the approaching chaos didn't concern him. He was still holding the card out toward her, his expression unreadable. But now, something about his stillness made her feel even more trapped. Was he in control of this situation, or was he just another part of something bigger, something more dangerous than she had imagined? Just as the sirens reached a fever pitch, the older woman stepped forward. Her voice, once soft and steady, now had an edge to it. "Take the card," she said firmly, her gaze locked onto the woman with the hose. "Take it, and walk away." The woman glanced at the older woman, a new understanding dawning on her. The older woman knew more than she was letting on. She wasn't just offering advice, she was trying to protect her, trying to steer her away from whatever was lurking behind the card and the man in the suit. But then the young man, the one who had warned the woman not to take the card, spoke up again. His voice was tight with urgency. "Don't listen to her. Don't take it." His eyes were wide with fear, his body tense as though ready to spring into action. "You don't know what you're getting into. This isn't a game." The woman's head spun as the two opposing voices crashed over her. "Take the card, and walk away. Don't take the card, or everything will change." She could feel the pressure of the decision weighing on her, the intensity of the moment making her chest tighten with every breath. The sound of approaching footsteps suddenly cut through the chaos, and the crowd parted to make way for two uniformed police officers, their faces grim and focused. They didn't even glance at the crowd. Their eyes were locked on the woman with the hose, and they moved toward her without hesitation. The man in the suit didn't flinch. His gaze remained on the woman, waiting, as if everything was part of the plan. The officers, however, seemed caught off guard by the sight of him. One of them glanced at the other, confusion flickering in their eyes. "You need to step back," one of the officers said, his voice authoritative as he approached the man in the suit. "This isn't your business." The man in the suit didn't respond. He simply stood there, his hands still at his sides, his expression unreadable. The officers exchanged a look, then moved in closer, but the moment they did, something unexpected happened. The woman, in a burst of panic, finally reached out and grabbed the card. She felt its smooth, cold surface in her hand, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The sirens, the shouting, the chaos, it all seemed to stop. Her mind went blank. She could feel the weight of the card, heavy with the promise of something she didn't fully understand. She didn't know why she had taken it, only that something inside her told her she had no choice. But just as she clutched it tightly in her palm, something snapped. A sharp, almost electric sound filled the air, like a door slamming shut. The woman's body went stiff as she looked up, her heart racing. The man in the suit's eyes had changed. They were no longer just calm or indifferent. Now, they were full of something else, something darker, more sinister. His lips curled into a slow, almost imperceptible smile, and that's when it hit her. The twist came too quickly, too sharply. The woman's hands shook as she stared at the card, the weight of the situation crashing down on her in full force. The card wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of control. But not in the way she had thought. Before she could make sense of it, the two officers reacted. One of them, the younger of the two, reached for his radio, his eyes wide with disbelief. His voice trembled as he spoke into the device. "We have a situation here," he said, his words rushed. "We need backup, now." The older officer turned to the woman with the hose, his face hardening. "You're under arrest for assault," he said, his voice final. "This ends now." But the woman barely heard him. Her mind was consumed with the realization that this moment had been manipulated all along. The man in the suit, the card, he officers, they were all part of something bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about her and the man she had tried to attack. This was a setup, a trap she had walked right into. As the officers moved toward her, one of them suddenly collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud. The younger officer's hand twitched, as though he were struggling to breathe, and his face contorted in pain. He tried to cry out, but no sound escaped his lips. The older officer looked down at him in shock, but it was too late. Something had already gone terribly wrong. And that's when the crowd erupted into chaos. People screamed, some tried to run, others stood frozen in place, their phones raised high, capturing the surreal moment. But the woman could only watch in horror as the officers, the man in the suit, and the entire situation began to spiral into something unrecognizable. In the confusion, she barely noticed when the older woman moved past her. She stepped toward the man in the suit, her face hardening as she finally spoke. "You didn't think she'd make it out, did you?" she said, her words barely above a whisper. "You knew she'd take the card. And now it's too late." The man in the suit didn't answer. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. And as the sirens blared louder, the woman with the hose felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. The card she held in her hand was just the beginning of something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The chaos in the streets seemed to stretch on forever, but as quickly as it had begun, it all fell silent again. The woman with the hose still stood there, the card clenched tightly in her hand, her breath shaky and uneven. She watched as the two police officers struggled, their bodies twitching unnaturally, their faces frozen in a mixture of confusion and fear. The younger officer's hand clutched his chest as though he couldn't draw air, his eyes wide, filled with terror. The older officer was still on the ground, unable to move, his face contorted in an expression of pain. The crowd, at first frozen in shock, now surged backward, as if instinctively realizing that something far beyond their control was unfolding right before them. Some ran, others stood still, their phones recording every moment. The woman could barely comprehend what she was seeing. What had happened to the officers? How had things escalated so quickly? Her mind was clouded, but one thought rose above the confusion: she had to get out. She had to leave before things got worse. She looked at the older woman, who was standing next to the man in the suit, her face a mask of calm determination. The older woman's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "You don't have to stay here," the older woman said quietly, her voice tinged with a sorrow that seemed to reflect the depth of the situation. "You don't have to be a part of this anymore." The woman with the hose felt the weight of the words pressing down on her. She had thought she had been in control, that the situation was something she could handle. But now, it was clear that everything had spiraled beyond her reach, and whatever had been set in motion could not be undone. The man in the suit, who had remained eerily calm throughout, took a step forward. His gaze never wavered as he looked directly at her. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice colder now. "But don't think for a second that you can walk away without consequences." For a moment, she stood there, her eyes locked with his, trying to make sense of it all. The card in her hand felt heavier than it ever had before. Was she really a part of something bigger than herself? Something she couldn't escape? But just as quickly as the man's voice had chilled her, the older woman stepped forward again, her eyes hardening with resolve. "Let her go," she said firmly. "This isn't her fight anymore." The man in the suit didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to look at the two officers, who were still on the ground, struggling to regain their composure. The situation seemed to be unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd, as if assessing the next move. Then, with a quick motion, he turned back to the woman and spoke, his voice colder than before. "You're free to leave," he said, though there was no warmth in his words. "But remember this. You don't just walk away from something like this." For a moment, the woman felt her heart race, unsure of whether she was being let go out of some twisted mercy or whether there was a deeper consequence waiting just out of sight. But in that instant, something clicked. The fear that had been gripping her since the moment the card touched her hand began to melt away. She didn't have to play into this. She didn't have to let them control her. Not anymore. Taking a deep breath, she turned and walked away, ignoring the man's cold stare and the lingering tension in the air. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, but it was liberating too. She was walking away from all the chaos, from the violence, and from the forces that had tried to manipulate her. She had no idea what was really going on, who the man in the suit was, what the card truly meant, or why it had all escalated so quickly. But for the first time, she felt like she was reclaiming control of her own life. As she reached the end of the street, she heard a voice behind her, faint but clear. "It's not over," the man in the suit called, his voice carrying through the air. "You'll never be free of this." She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She knew she had to move on. Whatever had been set in motion was beyond her understanding, but she wasn't going to let it consume her. She was walking away, choosing her own path, even if she didn't know where it would lead. The crowd had dispersed, and the sound of the sirens began to fade. The officers, still struggling to regain their footing, were slowly getting up, but they seemed dazed, as if they had just been through something they couldn't explain. It was almost as though they were part of something larger, something that was just starting to unfold. The woman with the hose felt a sense of finality in the air, but also uncertainty. She wasn't sure what would happen next, what would become of the card she had taken, or whether her decision would have any lasting consequences. But one thing was clear: her life had been irrevocably changed. And so, as she disappeared into the city's streets, a final thought lingered in her mind. She had survived this moment. But the real question was, could she survive the next one? The answers, it seemed, were just beyond her grasp. But for now, she was free. Or at least, she hoped she was.